While I was at the bank collecting my lottery winnings, my brother called and said, "3 men in a black Jeep just showed up at our house asking for you." I was standing at the teller window watching her count out $67,000 in cashier's checks when my phone started vibrating in my jacket pocket. The lottery office had insisted I take most of it in checks for security reasons, keeping only $5,000 in actual cash that now sat in a sealed envelope on the counter between us. My hands were shaking slightly as I watched her process the paperwork, still unable to believe this was really happening after playing the same numbers every week for 3 years since my divorce. The teller smiled and congratulated me again, making small talk about what I planned to do with the money while running my driver's license through her scanner for the 3rd time. I'd already told my family about winning yesterday, unable to keep the secret even 24 hours after checking my ticket at the gas station. My older brother Garrett had been genuinely happy for me, joking about finally being able to pay off the truck I'd been driving for 12 years and maybe taking my daughter Mia on a real vacation for once. But now his name was flashing on my screen with that urgent, repeated calling pattern that meant something was seriously wrong. I excused myself from the teller and stepped to the side of the bank lobby, pressing the phone to my ear while keeping my eyes on the cash and checks still sitting exposed on the counter. Garrett's voice came through tight and controlled in a way that immediately made my gut clench because my brother never sounded rattled. He said 3 men in a black Jeep had just pulled up to Mom and Dad's house where he was having lunch with his kids, and they'd knocked on the door asking specifically for me by my full name. When Garrett asked who they were, they claimed to be old friends wanting to congratulate me on my lottery win, but something about the way they carried themselves felt wrong enough that he'd refused to give them any information. They'd sat in the Jeep outside the house for another 10 minutes, just staring at the front door, before finally driving away slowly, while one of them held up a phone filming the property. Garrett wanted to know if I'd told anyone besides family about the win, if maybe I'd posted something online or mentioned it at work, and I felt my throat go tight as I realized I hadn't told anyone outside immediate family specifically because I was worried about exactly this kind of attention. The teller called my name and gestured that my transaction was complete, holding out the envelope of cash and the folder of cashier's checks with a bright smile that seemed wildly inappropriate given what Garrett had just told me. I walked back to the counter on legs that felt disconnected from my body and gathered up my winnings with hands that were now shaking for completely different reasons than excitement. Garrett was still on the phone asking if I was okay, and I told him I was just leaving the bank, that I'd be careful, trying to keep my voice steady so he wouldn't hear how badly this had spooked me. He made me promise to call him as soon as I got home and said he was filing a police report about the men showing up because their behavior crossed too many lines to ignore. I agreed and hung up, then stood in the middle of the bank lobby trying to decide what to do next, while other customers moved around me heading to tellers and ATMs like this was just another normal Wednesday afternoon. My truck was parked 2 blocks away in a public garage because the bank's lot had been full when I arrived, and now the walk back felt infinitely more dangerous than it had 30 minutes ago. I clutched the envelope and folder against my chest under my jacket and pushed through the bank's heavy glass doors into the bright October sunshine that should have felt celebratory, but instead felt exposing. The street was busy with lunch-hour foot traffic, people in business casual hurrying between buildings, and I scanned every face looking for signs of threat or recognition. A black Jeep sat at the red light on the corner, and my heart stopped completely until I saw it was full of college kids laughing and someone's arm hanging out the window holding a vape pen. I forced myself to keep walking at a normal pace, resisting the urge to run or look over my shoulder constantly, trying to blend in with the crowd heading back to offices. The parking garage entrance was just ahead, and I'd never been so grateful to see that dingy concrete structure in my life. I took the stairs instead of the elevator because elevators felt like traps where someone could corner me, and by the time I reached the 3rd floor where my truck was parked, I was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool air. My old Ford F-150 sat exactly where I'd left it 2 hours ago, looking completely normal and untouched, and I felt a wave of relief so intense I had to lean against the tailgate for a moment. I unlocked the doors with my key fob from several feet away, half expecting something terrible to happen, but nothing did. The truck beeped twice, and the lights flashed, and I slid into the driver's seat and immediately locked all the doors. For a moment I just sat there with the envelope and folder in my lap, staring at the concrete wall in front of my parking space, trying to process how quickly my good fortune had turned into this paranoid fear. Then I noticed it. A small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper that definitely hadn't been there when I parked. My hands started shaking again as I stared at it through the glass. White paper folded once, sitting there like a threat. I sat frozen for a full minute before forcing myself to get out and retrieve the note, looking around the parking structure for anyone watching. The level was mostly empty now during lunch hour, just a few scattered vehicles and no people visible anywhere. I grabbed the paper quickly and got back in the truck, locking the doors again before unfolding it with fingers that wouldn't stay steady. The message was printed in plain block letters. "Congratulations on your win. We'd like to discuss investment opportunities. Call within 24 hours, or we'll assume you prefer more direct communication." Below that was a phone number with no area code, just 10 digits. No signature, no company name, nothing that would identify who'd left this or how they knew about my lottery win that I'd only claimed yesterday. The casual tone made it somehow more threatening than if they'd been explicitly violent, this assumption that I'd comply with their timeline because they'd asked me to. I took a photo of the note with my phone and then started the truck, backing out of the space with my heart pounding and my eyes scanning every shadow and parked vehicle for movement. The drive down through the parking structure felt like it took forever, spiraling down level by level toward the exit, expecting at any moment to see a black Jeep blocking my path or men stepping out from between vehicles. But I made it to street level without incident and merged into traffic, checking my mirrors obsessively for any vehicle that seemed to be following me. A dark Tahoe pulled out of the garage behind me and stayed 3 cars back through 2 traffic lights, and I felt panic rising in my chest until it turned off onto a side street and disappeared. I was seeing threats everywhere now, unable to distinguish between normal city traffic and actual surveillance, my combat instincts from my deployment kicking in but not helping because I had no training for this civilian nightmare. Instead of going straight home to my apartment, I drove to the police station, the note and Garrett's report giving me enough cause to demand someone take this seriously. The station was a blocky concrete building that looked more like a storage facility than law enforcement, and I parked in the visitor lot and gathered my envelope and folder and the threatening note before heading inside. The lobby was fluorescent lit and smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, with a few people sitting in plastic chairs waiting and a tired-looking officer behind thick glass. I approached the window and started explaining about the lottery win and the men at my family's house and the note on my windshield, my words coming out clipped and controlled like I was giving a sit rep. The officer's expression shifted from bored to attentive as he listened, and he picked up a phone and called someone back into the station. Within minutes, a detective in plain clothes appeared through a side door and introduced himself as Lawrence Brennan, gesturing for me to follow him to an interview room. The interview room was exactly what you'd expect, small and windowless with a table and chairs and a camera mounted in the corner recording everything. Detective Brennan sat down across from me and pulled out a notebook, asking me to start from the beginning. I explained about winning the lottery yesterday, about telling only immediate family, about the men at Garrett's location, and the note on my truck, showing him the photo I'd taken. The detective wrote everything down in careful print and asked follow-up questions about amounts and timelines and whether I'd noticed anyone following me. When I mentioned the dark Tahoe that had been behind me leaving the garage, his expression turned serious, and he asked if I'd gotten a license plate number. I hadn't, too focused on evading to think about documentation, and I could see him making a note about that. He asked if I'd brought the lottery money with me, and I showed him the envelope and checks, and he whistled low and said $67,000 was more than enough to make me a serious target for criminals who monitored lottery winners. Detective Brennan explained that there were organized groups who tracked lottery winners through various means, bribing lottery office employees or monitoring public records of claims, sometimes even hacking social media to identify and locate targets. The fact that they'd found both my family's address and my vehicle location within 24 hours suggested a sophisticated operation with resources and information networks beyond what street criminals normally had access to. He wanted to take this seriously and proactively rather than waiting for escalation, and asked if I'd be willing to let them set up surveillance on my apartment and my family's home. I agreed immediately, knowing from my military experience that defensive positions and intelligence gathering were critical when dealing with an organized threat. Brennan said he'd coordinate with officers in Garrett's jurisdiction and get patrol units watching both locations, and that I should avoid being alone or following predictable routines until they figured out who was behind this. He photographed the threatening note and logged it as evidence, then gave me his business card with his direct line and told me to call immediately if anything felt off or I saw suspicious activity. I left the police station feeling marginally better that someone official was taking this seriously, but the tactical part of my brain was already running scenarios about how to secure my position and protect my daughter when she stayed with me on weekends. My apartment was a second-floor unit with exterior access, tactically vulnerable with too many approach vectors and no good fallback positions if someone breached the door. I drove there now through surface streets instead of the highway, taking random turns and doubling back to check for tails, basic evasion techniques that felt ridiculous in a civilian context, but necessary given the circumstances. My complex was modest, with open parking, and those external stairwells that I'd never thought twice about before, but now saw as perfect attack points. I parked in my assigned spot and sat in the truck for a full minute scanning the area before getting out, looking for the black Jeep or any unfamiliar vehicles or people who seemed to be watching. Everything appeared normal, but that didn't mean jack, because good surveillance was invisible until it was too late. I grabbed my envelope and folder and moved quickly up the external stairs to my second-floor unit, keys already in hand so I wouldn't have to fumble exposed at my door. The hallway was empty and quiet, most neighbors at work on a Wednesday afternoon, and I unlocked my door and slipped inside quickly before engaging the deadbolt and the chain. My apartment looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, undisturbed and normal, but I cleared every room anyway like we'd done in urban ops overseas, checking closets and behind doors and under the bed, feeling the muscle memory kick in even though I knew I was probably overreacting. The windows were all locked, and the sliding glass door to my balcony was secure with the bar wedged in the track. I set my lottery winnings on the kitchen counter and just stared at the envelope and folder, trying to reconcile being $67,000 richer with the threat that money was now attracting. This should have been one of the best days of my life, and instead, I was in condition orange in my own home, scanning for threats like I was back in Kandahar. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Kyle, asking if I wanted to grab beers tonight to celebrate my win, and I felt my blood run cold as I wondered how he knew. I called him immediately and asked where he'd heard about the lottery, trying to keep my voice casual. He laughed and said everyone knew, that someone had posted about it in our high school reunion group on social media last night with congratulations. I asked who posted it, and he pulled up the message while I waited, my jaw clenching tighter. A name I didn't recognize, Derek Paulson, with a profile photo showing some generic corporate headshot. Kyle said he didn't know who that was, but assumed it was someone from a class we didn't share back then. I told him something came up and I'd have to take a rain check on beers, then hung up before he could ask why I sounded tense. Someone had infiltrated our reunion group specifically to broadcast information about my win, and that level of planning suggested this wasn't opportunistic but calculated and organized, possibly even professional. I opened the group chat and found the post. Seeing dozens of responses congratulating me and asking questions about amounts and plans, some people I barely remembered from high school, acting like we were close friends now that I had money. The whole thing made my skin crawl. I screenshot the fake profile and texted it to Detective Brennan with an explanation about the reunion group, then reported the account to the platform for impersonation. But the damage was done. Dozens of people now knew about my windfall, and the information would spread through networks I had no way of controlling or monitoring. I thought about posting a clarification that the amount was smaller than people might think, trying to make myself seem like a less valuable target, but decided engaging publicly would only draw more attention. Instead, I went through my privacy settings on every platform, locking down everything that wasn't already private and removing any personal information that could be used to locate me or my family. My social media presence had always been minimal, but now I made it invisible, deleting old posts and restricting my profiles to friends only. That evening I tried to focus on work emails from my construction management job, responding to questions about the commercial project I was supervising and pretending everything was normal, but I couldn't concentrate. Every sound from the hallway made me tense. Every car door slamming in the parking lot below made me check the window, and I kept my phone within reach expecting another threatening message or call. Around 7 o'clock my phone actually did ring from an unknown number, and I let it go to voicemail at first, but then curiosity overrode caution, and I called it back. A man's voice I didn't recognize answered and asked if I'd received their note about investment opportunities. And before I could respond, he continued in this smooth, professional tone, saying they just wanted to help me manage my new wealth for a reasonable percentage fee. I asked who the hell he was and how he'd gotten my number, and he laughed and said information was easy to find for people who knew where to look. Then he rattled off my home address, my parents' address, Garrett's address, and the name of my daughter's elementary school, casual proof that he knew everything about me and everyone I cared about. My hand tightened on the phone so hard I thought I might crack the screen as he continued talking about how 48 hours was a reasonable timeline for me to think about their offer, and how they hoped I'd make the smart choice before they had to demonstrate their seriousness. The call ended before I could say anything, and I immediately called Detective Brennan even though it was past business hours. He answered on the second ring sounding like he'd been expecting contact, and I described the conversation trying to keep my voice level. He had me check my phone records to get the number, which turned out to be another burner routed through some internet service that made it untraceable. But the content of the call was enough to establish criminal extortion, giving them grounds for a more aggressive investigation. Brennan explained that protection racket schemes targeting lottery winners were unfortunately common, criminals offering protection from other criminals when the real threat was the people making the offer. The 48-hour deadline was designed to create time pressure and panic, classic intimidation tactics meant to force compliance. He told me not to respond to any further contact and to document everything, but absolutely not to pay them regardless of what threats they made. I asked what would happen when the deadline passed, and Brennan was honest that he didn't know. Some of these operations escalated to property damage or violence. Others just moved on to easier targets when they met resistance. He was working to identify the organization behind this and dismantle it before they could hurt anyone. But that took time I might not have. I hung up feeling more frustrated than reassured, my training telling me that defensive posture wasn't enough and I needed to take initiative somehow. But this wasn't a combat zone where I could identify threats and neutralize them. This was civilian law enforcement with rules and procedures that moved too slowly when organized criminals were operating on compressed timelines. I called Garrett and told him about the phone call and the threat against his kid's school, and I could hear the anger in his voice when he promised to talk to the principal tomorrow about enhanced security measures. We discussed him and his family staying somewhere else for a few days until this resolved, but he refused to be driven from his own home by criminals making threats. That night, I barely slept, my body back in deployment mode where you never fully relaxed because threats could come at any time from any direction. I'd left lights on throughout the apartment because darkness felt too vulnerable, and I kept my phone and my old service pistol within reach on the nightstand. Every sound made me alert. Footsteps in the hallway above, or doors closing, or cars starting in the lot below. Normal apartment noises that now felt potentially threatening. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat in my living room doing research on lottery winner crimes, finding horror stories about people being followed home and robbed, about home invasions and assaults, about criminals who specifically targeted winners because they knew victims had liquid assets and were often unprepared for organized attention. One article mentioned that most lottery-related crimes happened within the first 2 weeks of a win, when the money was most accessible and winners were most vulnerable. I was maybe 36 hours into that window and already dealing with professionals who knew my address and my family's locations. The next morning, I called in to work and explained I had a family emergency that would keep me out for the rest of the week. My supervisor was understanding without asking details I didn't want to give, and I appreciated that my construction background meant I had some credibility and people didn't question when I said something was serious. I needed to be mobile and ready to respond rather than trapped at a job site if something went wrong. And sitting in an office pretending everything was fine felt impossible when men with my information were planning whatever came next. I was making coffee when someone knocked on my door, not hard pounding but normal knocking like a neighbor or delivery. Through the peephole I could see a man I didn't recognize, maybe late 30s, wearing contractor clothes and holding a clipboard. He knocked again and called out, "Building maintenance, need to check your water heater." But I hadn't received any notice about maintenance, and the complex always sent emails before doing unit inspections. I didn't respond, didn't move, just watched him through the peephole as he waited. He knocked a third time and called out again, then pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking too quietly for me to hear through the door. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He set down the clipboard and pulled what looked like lock-picking tools from his jacket pocket and started working on my deadbolt. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while backing away from the door, telling the dispatcher in a low voice that someone was trying to break into my apartment right now and I needed officers immediately. She kept me on the line while dispatching units, asking questions about my location and the intruder's description. I could hear him working the lock, metal scraping against metal, professional technique that suggested this wasn't his first B&E. I moved to my bedroom and grabbed my pistol from the nightstand, chambering around and keeping it pointed at the floor while I positioned myself in the corner with the best sight lines to my front door. The dispatcher said officers were 2 minutes out and to stay on the line, but I could hear my front door opening now, the deadbolt finally giving way to whoever was working it. Heavy footsteps entered my apartment, and the man called out in that same casual tone, "Mr. Donovan, just need to talk to you about your financial situation. No need to make this complicated." His voice was closer, in my living room, and I could hear him moving through my space, opening doors and checking rooms. I stayed silent in my bedroom corner with my pistol raised now, finger outside the trigger guard but ready, every muscle memory from my training engaged. My bedroom door was closed but not locked, and I watched the handle turn slowly, the door opening inward as the intruder entered my last defensive position. He saw me immediately, saw the pistol aimed at his center mass, and his hands went up fast, showing empty palms. "Easy, man, easy. Just here to talk. On the ground, hands behind your head," I said, my voice steady and command level, the tone we'd used for detaining suspected insurgents. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating whether I'd actually shoot, and whatever he saw in my face convinced him to comply. He lowered himself to his knees, and then prone on my bedroom floor, hands laced behind his head, while I kept the pistol trained on him, and the dispatcher updated me that officers were entering the building. Sirens approached outside, and I heard boots pounding up the external stairs, and then officers were at my open front door calling out for me to identify myself. I called back that I was the resident with an intruder contained in the bedroom, that I was armed but not a threat, giving them enough information to not shoot me when they came through. 2 officers entered my bedroom with weapons drawn, and I immediately pointed my pistol at the floor and said I was the homeowner, gesturing to the man prone on my carpet. They secured him in handcuffs and hauled him to his feet while I set my pistol down on the dresser and showed them my concealed carry permit and my military ID. The officers were professional and efficient, one of them staying with the detained intruder while the other took my statement about what had happened. I showed them the lock-picking tools lying on my front doorstep and the damaged deadbolt, and explained about the lottery win and the threats I'd been receiving. Detective Brennan arrived 15 minutes later and took over the scene, his expression grim as he looked at the damage to my door and the man in handcuffs who was now refusing to answer any questions. They searched him and found more tools, a taser, zip ties, and a prepaid phone with recent calls to numbers they'd already flagged in their investigation. Brennan pulled me aside and said this was a major escalation, moving from threats to actual breaking and entering with tools that suggested kidnapping intent rather than just robbery. The attempted break-in changed the entire tactical situation, escalating from anonymous threats to direct action against my position in broad daylight. Detective Brennan explained that the 48-hour deadline hadn't even expired yet and they were already attempting physical access, which suggested either desperation or confidence that they could act with impunity. He no longer thought it was safe for me to stay at my apartment, even with increased patrol presence, and strongly recommended I relocate immediately to somewhere these people didn't know about. I thought about Garrett's offer to stay at his place, but immediately dismissed it, because I wouldn't bring this threat to his family after they'd already been targeted at the school. Brennan mentioned secure housing options for high-risk witnesses and victims, controlled access facilities with 24-hour security, and I agreed because tactically it was the right move, even though it felt like retreating. We arranged for me to pack essentials and relocate that evening, and Brennan assigned an officer to stand guard at my apartment while I gathered what I needed. I packed quickly and efficiently, military habits making it easy to grab exactly what I needed and nothing more. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, important documents, and my pistol with extra magazines because I wasn't going anywhere unarmed after today. The officer helped me carry bags down to my truck while maintaining security, scanning the parking lot and stairwells for threats. I drove to a bank first and deposited all the lottery money, keeping only a few hundred cash for immediate needs, figuring that made me less valuable as a physical target, even though anyone determined could probably access banking information with the right tools. The teller processed the large deposit with curious glances but no questions, and I left with deposit receipts and a substantially lighter envelope. Then I followed Detective Brennan's directions to the secure housing facility on the other side of town, a nondescript apartment building that looked like any other, except for the controlled access entrance and security cameras covering every angle. The secure apartment was small and utilitarian, furnished with basic pieces that felt more like a barracks than a home, but it was tactically sound with reinforced doors and windows and a security system connected directly to police dispatch. They gave me 2 prepaid phones and detailed instructions about operational security, not sharing my location with anyone who didn't absolutely need to know, and varying my routines if I had to leave the facility. The security coordinator was a former cop who'd done protective details, and he walked me through the building's security protocols and emergency procedures with the kind of thoroughness that actually made me feel marginally safer. I spent the rest of that day and the following night getting my head right, processing what had happened, and planning for what might come next. The deadline was now less than 12 hours away, and I still didn't know what would happen when it passed, whether they'd escalate further or cut their losses and move on. The call came at exactly the 48-hour mark, timed precisely to their original deadline. Unknown number, and I answered it because Detective Brennan had told me to engage enough to gather information without agreeing to pay anything. The voice was different from before, rougher and less professionally polished, and he said I'd made a serious mistake by ignoring their reasonable offer and involving law enforcement. The terms had changed now, he said. Instead of $40,000 for protection services, they wanted the full lottery amount as compensation for the trouble I'd caused them. He mentioned my daughter Mia by name, said it would be a shame if something happened to interrupt her normal happy life, because her father couldn't be reasonable. That reference to my 8-year-old daughter made something snap inside me, a cold rage settling over the fear and transforming it into something more focused and dangerous. I told him in a voice that was perfectly calm that if anyone touched my daughter, I would find them and kill them, and I meant every word of it. He laughed and said I should think very carefully about my priorities. Then the call ended. I immediately called Mia's mother, Rachel, and told her everything. Not the sanitized version, but the full truth about the threats and the break-in, and the organization targeting me. She listened without interrupting, and then said she was taking Mia out of school, and they were going to stay with her parents 3 hours away until this was resolved. I agreed that was the smartest move, and thanked her for not arguing or trying to minimize the danger. Rachel had always been practical and direct, one of the reasons we'd remained friendly after our divorce, and right now I was grateful she trusted my judgment about threats. She said she'd call the school and Mia's aftercare program and make up an excuse about a family emergency, nothing that would create gossip or questions. I told her I'd call Mia tonight to explain I'd see her soon, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fury still churning in my chest about these criminals threatening my daughter to get to me. Detective Brennan called 20 minutes later with news that changed everything. They'd identified the man who broke into my apartment through his fingerprints, a career criminal named Victor Halloway, with a jacket full of robbery and assault charges, who was currently out on parole. Halloway had lawyered up immediately and wasn't talking, but his parole was being violated for the break-in, and he was going back to prison regardless. More importantly, the phone they'd found on him had recent contact with numbers belonging to Vincent and Leo Cortez, 2 brothers with extensive records who were known to run protection rackets and extortion schemes. Brennan had enough now to get warrants for the Cortez brothers' homes and vehicles, and he wanted to move fast before they realized Halloway had been caught. He also wanted my help with something that made me both terrified and eager to end this. A controlled operation where I would appear vulnerable at a specified location while undercover officers monitored everything, trying to catch the Cortez brothers in the act with enough evidence to ensure serious prison time. The plan was simple in concept, but risky in execution. The Cortez brothers had sent another message after the deadline call, directing me to bring the full lottery amount to a parking structure near a mall at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. I would go there alone and apparently compliant, but wearing a wire and GPS tracker, with tactical units positioned throughout the structure ready to intervene when the criminals made their move. Detective Brennan emphasized that I was bait drawing out predators, there to let them incriminate themselves before officers took them down. He promised they'd be ready to move immediately if anything went wrong, but acknowledged there was real risk that violence could occur faster than they could respond. I signed waivers accepting the danger and agreeing to follow all instructions, and spent the next several hours being fitted with recording equipment, a microphone concealed in my jacket, and a panic trigger disguised as a key fob that would bring the entire tactical team crashing down if I pressed it. The night before the operation, I couldn't sleep at all, my mind running through scenarios and potential complications, identifying failure points in the plan and preparing contingencies. My training had taught me that operations never went exactly according to plan, and you had to be ready to adapt when things went sideways. I cleaned my pistol and checked my spare magazines, knowing I wouldn't be carrying it tomorrow because the wire and tracker would be detected if they searched me, and finding a weapon would blow the whole operation. Going in unarmed felt wrong on every level, but was tactically necessary for the setup to work. I tried to call Mia at her grandparents' house, but she was already asleep, so I left her a voicemail saying I loved her, and I'd see her really soon, trying to sound normal and not like I was going into a situation where I might get killed tomorrow. The morning came too fast, and I forced myself to eat breakfast, even though my stomach was twisted with tension, knowing I needed fuel for whatever physical demands the day might bring. Detective Brennan picked me up from the secure facility and drove me to an unmarked staging area where the tactical team was preparing, and I met the officers who'd be running Overwatch on the operation. They were professionals, quiet and focused, and they walked me through the setup one more time while checking all my equipment. The wire was working perfectly, the GPS tracker was broadcasting my location clearly, and the panic trigger was tested multiple times to ensure immediate response. Brennan reminded me that my job was to let the Cortez brothers show their hand, to get them on tape making demands and threats, to give the prosecutors everything they needed for an ironclad case. I just needed to stay calm and not do anything that might spook them before officers could move in. We drove to the mall in separate vehicles, me in my truck alone, and the tactical team in unmarked vans that I wouldn't be able to identify even though I knew they were following. The plan required me to look isolated and vulnerable, making the criminals confident enough to approach without suspecting the trap. I parked on the third floor of the structure where they'd specified, in a corner spot that had good camera coverage, but felt remote enough that they'd think we had privacy. Brennan's voice came through the tiny earpiece they'd given me, confirming I was in position, and all teams were deployed around the structure. I was supposed to wait in my truck until they approached, letting them make first contact and hopefully incriminate themselves quickly, so this could be over. 10 minutes passed with normal mall traffic, people parking and heading toward the shopping center, and I started to wonder if they'd detected the setup somehow and called it off. Then the black Jeep appeared, driving slowly up the ramp to the third floor and moving directly toward my section like they knew exactly where I'd be. My heart rate kicked up, but I controlled my breathing, staying loose and ready, watching them park 4 spots away from my truck. 3 men got out this time instead of 2, all wearing dark clothes and baseball caps, and they approached my vehicle with that specific purposeful walk that meant bad intent. The lead man tapped on my driver's window, and I rolled it down, trying to look nervous and compliant, which wasn't hard because I was genuinely on edge. He leaned down to window level and asked in an almost polite tone if I'd brought what they requested, the full lottery amount in cash. I told him I didn't have it here, that moving that much cash would have triggered bank alerts and drawn attention. His expression hardened, and the 2 men behind him moved to flank my truck, boxing me in tactically. The lead man pulled out his phone and showed me photos, recent surveillance shots of Mia at her grandparents' house playing in the backyard, images taken within the last 24 hours. "Your daughter's safe with Grandma and Grandpa," he said, his voice dropping to something ugly beneath the professional veneer. "Let's make sure she stays that way. You've got until tonight to get our money together, all of it, or we start making examples." The casual way he threatened my 8-year-old daughter while showing me proof they'd tracked her despite my efforts to hide her made something break inside me. My hand moved toward the door handle, and one of the flanking men must have seen it because he suddenly shouted, "He's got something!" And everyone's position shifted from threatening to actively aggressive. The lead man reached into his jacket, pulling what looked like a weapon, and my combat instincts took over completely. I threw the truck door open hard, slamming it into the lead man and knocking him backward. Then I was out of the vehicle and moving. Everything happened in compressed time after that, my training and experience taking over while conscious thought fell away. The man to my left tried to grab me, and I redirected his momentum into the side of my truck, using his own force against him. The man to my right was pulling a gun, and I closed distance before he could bring it up, controlling his weapon arm and delivering 2 hard strikes that put him down. The lead man recovered and came at me, and we grappled between vehicles, both of us fighting for position and advantage. I heard Brennan's voice screaming through the earpiece for the tactical team to move in, but they were too far away, and this was happening too fast. The lead man got his hand on what turned out to be a knife and slashed at me, the blade catching my forearm and opening a hot line of pain. I grabbed his knife arm at the wrist and twisted, using joint manipulation to force him to drop the weapon, then swept his legs and put him on the ground hard. Sirens were wailing now, and police vehicles were racing up the parking structure ramps, but the third man who'd been flanking right had recovered and was running for the Jeep. I sprinted after him on pure instinct, not thinking about the operation or letting him escape, just reacting to a threat trying to flee. He made it to the Jeep and started the engine, and I got there just as he began moving, grabbing the door handle and yanking it open. He accelerated hard, trying to shake me, and I held on, half in the vehicle and fighting to control him, while the Jeep swerved wildly through the parking structure. We crashed through the structure's exit barrier and roared down the spiral ramp way too fast. Him trying to drive and fight me off simultaneously, while I tried to get control without letting go and being thrown from the moving vehicle. At the second floor, he lost control completely, and we hit a concrete support column head-on, the impact violent enough to deploy airbags and slam both of us around inside the cab. I came to with my head ringing and blood running into my eyes from somewhere on my scalp, the Jeep's engine still running and smoke pouring from under the crumpled hood. The driver was unconscious or worse, pinned against the deployed airbag, and I managed to extract myself from the wrecked vehicle and stagger a few steps before my legs gave out. Police officers and EMTs surrounded me within seconds, and I remember trying to tell them about the other two men still on the third floor, trying to make sure the threat was contained before I let myself check out. Someone was wrapping my bleeding forearm, and another person was checking my head injury, and Detective Brennan's face appeared above me asking if I could hear him. I nodded and asked if they got all three, and he confirmed both the Cortez brothers were in custody on the third floor with multiple officers securing them. The driver who'd crashed was being extracted from the Jeep and would be arrested as soon as medical cleared him. The EMTs wanted to transport me to the hospital for evaluation, but I refused until Brennan confirmed that Mia was still safe at her grandparents', and that he'd dispatched officers there for enhanced security. Only after I knew my daughter was protected did I agree to get into the ambulance, and even then, I made them leave the doors open so I could see what was happening around me. The ride to the hospital was a blur of questions from paramedics about my symptoms and pain levels while they worked on my injuries. The knife wound on my forearm needed stitches, and my head injury was bleeding more than it was serious, both wounds looking worse than they actually were. I'd been in combat enough times to know the difference between catastrophic damage and superficial trauma, and this was superficial, despite how it looked. At the hospital, they stitched my forearm with 15 sutures and glued the head laceration closed, gave me a CT scan that showed no serious brain injury, and cleared me with instructions to follow up if symptoms worsened. Detective Brennan was waiting when I was discharged, and he drove me back to the secure facility while updating me on what they'd recovered. Both Cortez brothers were facing multiple felony charges, including extortion, stalking, attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and conspiracy to commit robbery. They'd found extensive evidence in the Jeep and on their phones showing a sophisticated operation that had been targeting lottery winners across 3 states for at least 2 years. Victor Halloway had already agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges, providing testimony about how the organization worked and who else was involved. Additional arrests were coming as investigators followed leads to the lottery office clerk who'd been selling winner information and the private investigator who'd been handling surveillance and intelligence gathering. The whole network was being rolled up systematically, and Brennan was confident the prosecutions would be solid enough to ensure serious prison time for everyone involved. The civilian who'd been driving the car that got hit during the initial chase aftermath was treated for minor injuries and released, his vehicle totaled, but his body intact, which was the best possible outcome from that disaster. I felt enormous guilt about his involvement despite knowing logically that the Cortez brothers' choices had caused everything that followed. Brennan assured me the driver's insurance and victim compensation funds would handle all damages and medical bills, and that no criminal liability would fall on me for the parking structure crash since I'd been fighting for my life against an armed assailant who'd been fleeing from police. The department's legal review had already cleared me of any wrongdoing in the incident, finding that my actions were justified self-defense under extreme circumstances. I spent the next 3 days in the secure facility recovering from my injuries and decompressing from the adrenaline and trauma of the operation. Brennan kept me updated on the continuing investigation, including searches of the Cortez brothers' properties that had yielded even more evidence of their criminal enterprise. They'd been running this operation for years with multiple crews targeting different categories of victims, lottery winners being just one specialty. The organization had made millions through extortion and robbery, and dozens of previous victims were now coming forward after seeing news coverage of the arrests. Prosecutors were building a case that would likely result in decades of prison time, effectively dismantling an operation that had terrorized vulnerable people across multiple jurisdictions. Rachel brought Mia back from her grandparents after Brennan confirmed the immediate threat was neutralized, and I got to see my daughter for the first time in almost a week. She ran to me and hugged me carefully around my bandaged arm, asking what happened and why I looked hurt. I told her a simplified version about bad men who'd wanted money and how police had caught them, leaving out the violence and terror because she was 8 and didn't need those nightmares. She seemed satisfied with the explanation and mostly just wanted to show me the drawings she'd made at her grandparents' house, normal kid stuff that made everything else feel distant and manageable. Rachel thanked me for handling the situation and keeping Mia safe despite the danger, and I could tell she'd been scared despite her practical demeanor. We agreed I'd take Mia next weekend as usual now that things were secure, and they left with Mia chattering about school and friends and all the normal concerns of childhood. 2 weeks after the parking structure operation, Detective Brennan called with the news that the Cortez brothers had both pleaded guilty as part of a deal that required full cooperation with ongoing investigations. Vincent, the older brother and apparent leader, would serve 20 years minimum before parole eligibility. Leo would serve 15 years. Victor Holloway got 10 years for his cooperation and testimony against the organization. The lottery office clerk and private investigator both pleaded guilty to their respective charges and received 5-year sentences. The whole criminal network that had terrorized me for those terrible days was now in prison or awaiting sentencing, and I could finally relax my security posture without constantly expecting another threat. Brennan said I could move back to my regular apartment whenever I felt ready, that the investigation had found no evidence of additional organization members still active or interested in pursuing me. I waited another week before returning to my apartment, using that time to have professional security systems installed with cameras and monitored alarms connected directly to police dispatch. The building management replaced my damaged door and deadbolts with commercial-grade hardware that would be substantially harder to defeat, and I added window sensors and motion detectors that would alert me to any attempted entry. The apartment felt different after everything that had happened there, contaminated by the memory of Victor Holloway breaking in while I waited in my bedroom corner with a pistol. But it was home, and it was mine, and I refused to let criminals force me out permanently. I also refused to let the lottery money sit unused because criminals had targeted me for it, so I started making practical decisions about paying off debts and establishing my daughter's college fund and investing the remainder in ways that would provide long-term security. 3 months after winning the lottery, I could finally say the immediate danger was over and life was returning to something approaching normal. I went back to work at my construction management job, where my supervisor had held my position and welcomed me back without asking too many questions about my absence. Mia stayed with me on weekends as usual, and we fell back into our routines of movie nights and cooking together, and her showing me homework while I tried to help with math problems that were somehow harder in 3rd grade than I remembered. The scars on my forearm faded from angry red to pale silver, physical reminders of the day I'd fought 3 men in a parking structure and survived. I kept in touch with Detective Brennan, who occasionally called to update me on the prosecutions and continuing investigation into other victims of the organization. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.